Hello, Year 10. So, our first lesson on Elizabeth. This is going to be an introduction to Elizabethan England. And here I want to look at what society was like in Elizabethan times. And I want to see how Elizabeth ruled the country as well in 1558, because obviously it was too much for one person to do on their own. Now, your only task this lesson is for you to make notes on key terms that I mention throughout. And I would recommend flashcards where possible. Here I've modelled how you might do that with a question on the front and your answers on the back. And this will help you with your revision later on. You can keep flicking through them and checking your own knowledge there. You should be able to explain the different functions of Elizabethan society, so where the different groups were, how it changed in the towns, different groups in towns, and how Elizabeth used different groups to control England. Now, we don't need to see your work for this. I'm going to trust that you're doing it. You want to be aware of these key terms as we go on throughout the course. This is a great starting point here. So, Elizabethan England, society was based on what we call a hierarchy. And this means you were in a group. You're in one of these groups you can see on this diagram. And where you were depended on your wealth and your power. And how do we determine how much wealth you had in Elizabethan England? Well, it could be with coins, but it was also to do with land as well, how much property you owned. The more property you had, the more wealth and power you had as a result of that. So let's go from the top with nobility. Obviously a very small group at the top. The monarch was the most important noble of all, but there were other nobles as well. These are people that are in the royal family or people with titles. For example, Earl, for example, or Dame, and things like that. They own lots of land across the country, and these are very wealthy individuals. They are a small part of England, but they are incredibly wealthy and own lots of land throughout the country. Moving down, we've then got the gentry. These aren't nobles, but they are wealthy individuals. They own lots of lands themselves, and they would often rent this land to people beneath them in the hierarchy. So it would say, okay, you can rent these fields from me for more money so I can keep my power as a result. Yeomen are next. So these are people who own a small amount of land, not as much as the gentry. But again, they might rent some of their lands to people beneath them. So they would look after the land and they would make some money from renting that land out to others. And these are often professional workers, yeomen. So they have got paid jobs. And beneath them, then we see a bigger gap. We've got the tenant farmers. These are people who would rent land from the gentry or the yeomen. They would grow crops on there and they would make a living that way. Beneath them, an even bigger group now, we've got pretty much the majority of England, landless or labouring poor. So people who don't own any land of their own, they would work on the land for the tenant farmers. They don't rent land, they don't own any land. They just work on the land for those farmers to help them to make money. And if you weren't in any of those positions, I'm afraid you were stuck at the bottom. You were the vagrants or the homeless, who will come out throughout this course quite a bit. These people had no land, they had no job, they had no one to work for, no regular income. And so as a result, they were seen as criminals. People were scared of having them in the area. Laws were made to be harsh. These people sort of chased them out of the towns and so on. People didn't want anything to do with the vagrants or the homeless. These people are at the very bottom of society, and it's tough for them to work their way up. So that's in general in Elizabethan England, that hierarchy. When we move to the towns, there's a few changes. So at the very top in towns, again, your status depends on your wealth. The more money you have got, the higher your status is. At the very top are the merchants. We've got an example there in a picture. Check out that haircut. That is ridiculous. 2 wedges on each side of the head. But anyway, merchants owned a lot of property, owned a lot of shops and businesses and so on, so they could make money that way. Property is how they make money. Next, we've got the professionals. These are people in well-paid jobs, like your lawyers, like your doctors, not so much your history teachers. Next up, we've got business owners and skilled craftsmen, people like carpenters who make things out of wood, or tailors, people who make things out of clothing, like we can see in the picture there. I'm not quite sure why the face has been blurred to conceal this person's identity. But these individuals could be quite wealthy. They would also employ people to work for them as well, to build these businesses up. Next, we've got skilled craftsmen. These would work for business owners. These would include things like apprentices as well, really young workers. So people who could actually make things were employed to do that in the towns. And then again at the bottom, and a lot of people we can see here fell into this category, people without a skill, people without a job. They're at the bottom, and they were just people who struggle to find work and to make money. And again, these are people, like vagrants, you don't really want them in your town if they're not contributing. So the laws could be quite harsh to them. Now, let's move on to Elizabeth herself. So, as you would expect, Elizabeth would need help in controlling the country. Just like we saw with the Tsar, if you remember, back with Russia. Russia was a huge country, so the Tsar needed help in controlling it. Well, in 1558, it's a very similar thing. Elizabeth needs help in controlling the country. She cannot do it all on her own. So a government has got several parts to it. Each of those parts has got a different role. So let's start from the top. Let's look at the court. So we've got a picture here of that. And these are people who lived or lived near the same place as the monarch. And you needed permission from the monarch to attend. You can't just be a regular person and just turn up in the court. But here in the court, you would see members of nobility. And these would be people who could give advice to the monarch. And these could also be friends of the monarch as well. And as a result, these people have got influence with the monarch. They can give advice. The monarch would often listen to these people in the court. So they can change England. They can advise Elizabeth on what to do. And also, the court for Elizabeth is a public display of wealth and power because it's such a grand place, really. You can see how the people are dressed. You can see the sort of decorations you've got in the palace. And so, as a result, the court is a status of wealth. But it's not just the court. You've got the Privy Council, the lads as I call them there. I don't think there was any females in the Privy Council ever, but you can please feel free to research that and prove me wrong. Now, the Privy Council were a group of approximately 19 advisors that were chosen by the monarch. These were nobles and government officials. These were people well up. She's not getting vagrants to be in the Privy Council. And these people would meet up at least 3 times a week, often with the monarch there as well. And they would discuss and they would debate current issues with the Queen. For example, what should they do about certain countries? How should they treat the poor in England? How could the country make more money? What should they do about religion? And they would give their own views. They'd give their own advice to Elizabeth as well. But their job was to make sure once that meeting was over, even if they'd not been listened to at all, they had to make sure the Queen's decisions were carried out. And that meant they oversaw the law and order, local government and the security of England. So the Privy Council, incredibly important to Elizabeth. One member of the Privy Council would be the Secretary of State. This was the most important Privy Councillor, and these were the people in government Elizabeth was closest to and would be key in giving advice. But it's not just those people as well. You've also got Parliament as well. And if the monarch needed extra money, then the monarch could call Parliament if they needed what we call extraordinary taxation. That's where normal taxes aren't enough. The country needs more money, so for example, to prepare for an army, and so you need Parliament to come along to agree to collect more taxes to give to the Queen. And Parliament would also need to agree to any laws that the Queen wanted to make, although Parliament tended to do that straight away. They didn't really argue with the monarch here. Parliament could also offer advice to the monarch as well. But there's some areas where the Queen wasn't interested in talking to Parliament at all. It was just basically she saw it as royal prerogative, and that meant it's no one else's business but hers. And this would include things like who she should marry. So Elizabeth basically thought, well, no, don't discuss who I'm going to marry. I'll decide, thank you, it's none of your business. Who should replace her on the throne when she died if she had no children. And foreign policy as well, how England should act with other countries. That's what that key term means there. How should England act with France? How should they act with Spain? Should they go to war with them? Should they try and be more peaceful with them? And so these were issues where basically Elizabeth doesn't want to know from Parliament. Parliament's got a little bit of power. Elizabeth calls them 9 or 10 times during her reign. But actually the main thing is that they collect money and they agree to her laws. Apart from that, you've also got the Lord's Lieutenant. So the monarch chooses a Lord's Lieutenant for each county. These were noble people again. You don't have the vagrants, the homeless being Lord's Lieutenants. And often they're on the Privy Council as well. They're one of those 19 people. And what they do is they help keep the monarch in power by making sure that in their county, the monarch's policies, so rules and laws, were carried out. And also, if you imagine that England suddenly needed to raise a large army, for example, when Spain were invading, then the Lord Lieutenant job would be in their county to raise what we call a militia. And that would be an army of ordinary people. So it's his job to say to all of the males in the area, all right, guys, grab your weapons. I don't care if you're a normal person. I don't care if you're a baker, for example, or a tailor. You need to go to war here. We need to raise this army up quickly to defend England. That is the Lord Lieutenant job in each county, to make sure that the militia is ready if needed, and to make sure in that area, Elizabeth, laws and policies are being followed. You've also got Justices of the Peace, or JPs. JPs were large landowners, and they made sure that in their area, local law and order was being followed. So if you imagine, if we go back, Lord Lieutenant deals with the entire county, but that's still quite a big area. A smaller area, like a town, would be the focus of the JPs. They would make sure that the Queen's policies were being carried out, and they would report to the Privy Council, or often the Lord Lieutenant, as we've just seen. Now, being a JP seems really important, and it was. It wasn't a paid job, but it was a position of status within your town or area. I am the Justice of the Peace. I report to the Lord Lieutenant, to the Privy Council, who report to the Queen. There is status there. So although you're not paid for your work, it's still a position that a lot of people wanted. It was a very popular job. And finally, we've got Elizabeth herself. So the monarch makes all important decisions. And the reason for that was because monarchs at the time believed they'd been selected by God to be ruler. The idea was that there's 2-3 million people in England at this time, let's say. And out of all of those people, the monarch had been picked. This is because it was God's choice. The monarch was the right person to lead. The monarch was the person who would make the right decisions. And this later became known as divine right of kings or queens. This means that the monarch can declare war or make peace with a country. They're the only person that can do that. The monarch can call parliament, and the monarch can agree or reject the laws that parliament wants to be made. The monarch can give land, titles like Sir or Dame, money, and jobs to people. That's what we call patronage, where you give someone a title, you give someone land, or you maybe sponsor and give money to someone's cause. Now, other people could do that, but the Queen or the monarch is the most important patron there is in England at this time, because they're obviously the most important person and the wealthiest person. And that meant the Queen could actually get people on side by giving them titles like Sir, or by giving them money, or by giving them land. And so that meant you get people on side, and it's a form of control because she can take these things away if these people displease her as well. So, that's it. That's just a very quick tour through society and government in 1558. And just to recap, make notes on those key terms. So what does gentry mean, for example? What was the Yeo farmers, for example? Those sort of things. Just a few notes on the back. You can do this however you want. We're not going to check up on you for this, but you have got flashcards are a great way of doing this. There's the revision guide as well in Google Classrooms if you need it. And that's it. Thank you very much. Lesson 2 should be up as well for you, where we can start to look at Elizabethan society in a bit more detail and focus on Elizabeth's problems she faced in 1558 when she became a monarch. Thank you very much, Year 10. Take care. Bye-bye.